So I'm going to talk today about the results of this paper that we recently published in the Economic Journal. And basically, this is about gender stereotypes in academia. So what we start with as an observation is that there's strong gender imbalances in academia. And so what we can see here on the right-hand side is that if we look at the staff in British universities, there's a lot more male than female professors, full professors, no matter what age you look at. That's also something that we observe if we look at other ranks of senior academics, like senior researchers. The picture looks a little bit more balanced when you look at other academics. But if you were to break down this into math intensive and not math intensive fields, you would see that this is still quite imbalanced for math intensive fields. On the left-hand side, we've got a picture of the percentage female tenure track assistant professors in the US. So this is American data. It comes from a paper by Chechi et al. Published in 2014. And what we can see is that basically there's been progress in terms of gender representation in academia over time. So starting from the 70s to the 2010s, roughly. But this progress has led to parity in few fields. So there's one that has met parity, which is psychology, but most other fields still are below parity. And in certain fields, in particular in the case of economics, we see that there's been reversion in progress. So in economics, the share of female assistant professors has actually gone down. And papers that have focused on economics have expanded the time horizon here and say, well, we can see that this proportion has either gone down or at least stalled in its progress. So we've got this observation that in many fields, math-intensive fields, and in economics in particular, there's this low gender representation of women. Now, this, you could just say it doesn't matter. It's just the choices of women not to enter these fields. But from the perspective of the kind of science and knowledge that we're creating, this can generate problems. So if you've got a discipline that has strong gendered imbalance, that can lead to a narrowed perspective. And there's been extensive research on this, both theoretical and empirical, on the importance of diversity in teams when trying to solve complex tasks. So solving problems that are complex. And that is the nature of academic and scientific work, right? So solving complicated problems. And when you've got a team that's more diverse, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a dividends of that diversity because you may have more questions that get asked of a specific problem. So you have more opportunities for solution that can also lead to different innovative perspectives on a particular problem. And there's also research that shows that more diverse team may then lead to have more attention to detail and more attention to process that can decrease the probability of error. So there's work on this that has been published in across different fields, and looking at experiments and getting people to solve complex tasks. There's also anecdotal evidence in which this lack of diversity can lead to enormous mistakes. So this is one of my favorite examples of what happened to Apple, which is arguably one of the most innovative companies in the world that has they're proud of being a company that has strong attention to detail and releases products that are not buggy and expensive, quite sophisticated products. And when they released their first health tracking app in 2014, it was widely covered on tech news. So here's on The Verge that the health tracking app actually didn't have the possibility to track periods, so menstruation, which is arguably one of the oldest forms of health tracking that humans have been doing. And so there's extensive work on this was only possible because the teams that were conducting these things were predominantly only male teams and they didn't ask themselves that question. So that's the kind of mistakes that you can have when you have that kind of narrowed perspective. Now, so the big goals of our project and the kind of subsequent projects that we want to work on this agenda is to try to identify institutional and implicit mechanisms that may limit women's career progression in science and in academia. So the reason why we're asking the question in this way is that there's extensive evidence that there's this imbalance And there's also evidence that people care a lot about this. So people want to attract women. There's objective efforts in terms of for universities, for instance, that have created EDI committees, professional bodies that have paid a lot of attention to questions such as sexual harassment. They created devices to improve the reporting and improve how this is handled. So there's a lot of effort in terms of curbing down explicit discrimination. But despite these efforts, we don't see an enormous progression in the representation of women. So you may think that this is just due to time, we need more time. Or you can think that there are other forms of more implicit barriers and not like such explicit barriers that are limiting the progression of women. So in our case, the specific question that we ask is, how do academics talk about their PhDs? So how is that like something that relates to institutional and implicit mechanisms? Well, we're going to look at reference letters. So the letters that academics write when they're recommending their students to get a job. And in economics, that's like a very highly structured, institutionalized procedure. So we're going to look how the institution of the economics job market that relies heavily on reference letters interacts with the implicit biases that people have when they actually write and informally talk about somebody without any kind of structure that's imposed onto them. You're quite free in how you write these letters. And specifically, we're going to figure out whether academics, when they write about their students, whether they rely on stereotypes. How do we do this? So what is it that we actually do? So we've got access to a lot of letters. We've got access to roughly 12,000 letters. And I'll tell you why that's the case. And what we do is that we will process these letters and analyze these letters using natural language processing, which is the branch of AI that's dealt with having computers read and process, say understand, although there's debates as to what that means, but read and process text. And so that allows us to kind of analyze really a lot of material. And we're going to classify the type of attributes that are emphasized in letters and compare whether the kind of emphasis that's put in these letters differs between men and women. We're going to look at attributes that highlight, so descriptions that highlight natural talent, rhinestone characteristics, so whether people work really hard, recruitment prospects, adjectives stand out, so whether you talk about somebody as being excellent or outstanding, and teaching and citizenship characteristics. These categories, we take them from previous, more qualitative research that's been done on reference letters. So a preview of the answers we find when we ask these questions, we do find that academics rely on stereotypes. In particular, women tend to be described a lot more as hard workers. So people who just work really hard and like are very diligent, that sort of praise. And they're far less likely to receive stellar praise. So like having outstanding type of signals in their letters. We show that this is likely to be affecting the quality of recruitment. And in terms of analyzing where this comes from, we show that this form of stereotyping, and I'll explain a little bit more why we consider this to be a form of stereotyping, tends to be more common for people who know the candidates less. So put it another way, the direct PhD supervisor of a candidate is far less likely to engage in this differential treatment of men and women than people who are a second or third person in a PhD committee, or somebody who's writing a letter that you may have worked with during an internship for 6 months or a visiting position just for 6 months. And so this is important because the kind of theoretical work and also the work in psychology about stereotyping really thinks about stereotyping as images that we refer to when we don't have perfect information. So we don't have perfect information about somebody, and so we may rely on the stereotype to fill in these gaps. So how is it the case that we can analyze the letters of like 4,000 candidates or 3,700 candidates, and that we got access to these 12,000 letters? So the reason that that is the case is that the job market in economics, so these are going to be letters in economics, is a highly structured organization. So every year in our profession, around this time of the year, actually in November, institutions will post job offers in a platform, Econ Job Market, and candidates and reference writers will interact in that platform. So candidates will submit their papers, their CVs, what we call their application package in the platform. Professors will submit the reference letters, so one per candidate, independently, and the candidates don't get to see their letters. So the platform ensures that anonymity. But the candidate can then decide to apply to as many jobs as they want, and the platform will be submitting the letter so that the candidate doesn't see the letter, but it gets submitted without cost for the professor to each individual institution that is posting a job offer. From the point of view of the institution, what that means is that at the end, it can collect all these applications and then they download all the packages that they've received. So here an example, the University of Sydney had a job offer for associate professorships. They got all these applications and they downloaded all the packages. For the point of view of the candidate, sending an application bears then very little cost because most of these institutions are asking for the same thing. They're asking just for paper and a CV and perhaps a cover letter. That's about it. And they don't need to ask for every job offer that their supervisor sends the letter, which tends to be the very costly thing. And so they'll apply to a lot of jobs that in places that they don't want to go because they see that as straining if they get an interview for a job that they actually want. And also sometimes, or actually more than sometimes, very often, they also submit to places where they have no chances of getting a job. That means that for the point of view of the recruiter, we get a lot of applications. So to give you an example, so we're here dealing with the applications of just one institution over 4 years. Every year you get something between, so now this has increased, but now in the more recent past, you get something between 800 and 1,000 applicants every year that were in the job market. These applications are roughly representative of those received by other research-intensive institutions. Benchmarking in terms of gender, 30% of them come from women, which matches the proportion of female PhD graduates in economics from research-intensive institutions. And the kind of applications that we're looking at come from institutions roughly predominantly in the top 200 institutions, which are kind of research-intensive institutions in economics. So once we've got that, what is it that we do? So the first thing that we do is that we try to get a descriptive perspective on these letters. So we're going to run what is called an unsupervised analysis, and we are just going to process the text so that the machine can read it. And once the machine can read it, we're going to ask, what are the words that are most commonly predictive of letters written for women and the words that are most predictive of letters written for men? This is done through something that's called a lasso. And what it will allow us to do is to pick up the strongest predictors of letters for women and the strongest predictors of letters written for men without putting too much emphasis on terms that may predict letters for women, but just very few of them, okay? So if there's just one woman who's worked on the history of HIV, we won't pick up that term as being a strong predictor of women because it just predicts actually one woman. So these are both strong predictors in terms of how precisely they predict a letter for a woman or a man, and also how many of these predictions they can actually do. So here it's a lot of text, so that's like something we have to deal with when we work with text. I'm showing the words that are the most predictive for letters written in favor of women on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we show the words that are the most predictive of letters written for men. The strongest predictors for women are here at the top, and the strongest predictors for men are here at the bottom. So in terms of the magnitude of the prediction. And when you look at that, there's quite a lot that's going on. And there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. So number one is that we've got to acknowledge that there's quite a few research words. We do our best in our approach to trim out the part of the letter that will be devoted to research, but some terms still filter out and are strong predictors, especially in fields that are very dominated by one gender. So here's an example. There's quite a lot of work on gender and on women. And this kind of work tends to be predominantly done and carried out by women. So that's why this ends up being a really strong predictor of a letter written for a woman. Saying there's quite a lot of work on game theory, and that kind of work tends to be predominantly made by men. And so that's how these words filter out here. But once we've kind of passed that, we see also that there's a lot of praise. So there are nice things that are said because these are recommendation letters. We say things that her research may end up in a good journal, that they're a pleasant person. But these positive things are not the same kind of positive for men and women. So this is subtly different praise. So just without imposing any structure, we already see that women, their specific words, especially words that qualify that people are hard workers, like try harders type of people, they tend to be in letters for women, driven, hard work, determined, these sort of words. Words that highlight creativity here, words such as breath, creative, having an eye for things, being a thinker, they appear as very strong predictors of letters for men. Something else that we thought is something that we can only see when we do this kind of quite unsupervised analysis is that the way we highlight personality is subtly different for men and women. So whereas women sometimes we get a primary saying, oh, this person's shy, so their seminar may be a bit this and that, or they're quiet, we see that men don't get these sort of words, and the symmetric version of it may be something like humble or modest, which, just probably highlights the same thing. Now, the second part of an analysis is a lot more structured. So what we do is that we create dictionaries. So that means we are going to take all the kind of common words that we see in the letters and highlight among these words those that refer to a specific characteristic. So what are the words that tend to refer to ability? So you're a natural talent, ease with things, you're a creative thinker, those sort of words. Words that refer to grindstone, so being a hard worker, diligent type of person. Words that refer to recruitment, because in our letters we tend to be super explicit about recruitment. Those that are adjectives that kind of emphasize things, so standout characteristics, excellent, again, outstanding, that sort of thing. And terms that relate to teaching and citizenship. So that's the left-hand side of the paper. Of the slide. So let me talk a little bit about that. So we see that the result that is the most salient across all of our specification and different cuts of the sample that we do is that women are much more likely to get described as grindstone, so as working hard. This is true for the entire sample, whether we focus on top institutions only, whether we compare male and female writers, all sorts of different cuts, we still see that women get described as hard workers. Depending on the cut of the sample, we see that they're more or less likely, so they're significantly or not less likely to be described with ability words. In the overall sample, there is this negative effect, so women are less likely to have ability words, but it's not significant. If we focus on fields that emphasize technical abilities a lot, so theory, this becomes significant. So that's the first result that we observe. The second set of results that we observe are here described in the right-hand side of the paper. So in economics, it's not uncommon to be quite blunt about the signal that you have in terms of the recruitment possibilities of a student. So at the end of a letter, you may say, this student should be looked at by all institutions, or by all institutions, including the top 10 in the world, or by all institutions, including the top 5. So this would be what we can consider like a really positive signal, a stellar signal. The closest you get to a slightly negative sentiment, which is more like a doubt kind of sentiment, is what we call here negative signals, that you may say, this student is great, and I encourage all institutions outside the top 20, outside the top 30 to have a look at them, or only institutions in a specific country. So that would be like more of a down tone put in the letter, or like a negative type of signal. So the first thing that we observe is that the difference comes in the praise. So people are not more likely to talk negatively about women than men. So the probability that there's a negative signal, the total number of negative signals, the fact that the net signal that you get if there are multiple signals in a letter is negative, all of that is not significantly different for men and women. So here we're not directly talking about like having negative views about women. We're talking more about something more subtle, which is how likely are you to really have a stellar view on your female candidate? And what we see is that the probability of having a really positive signal, given here, or the total number of really positive signals, given here, those are significantly less likely to appear in letters written in support for women. So just to have a discussion on this, we find like the most salient thing that we find over and over again is that women tend to be described more as hard workers than men. Now, we may say that working hard is a good thing and that we shouldn't care about that too much because it's something that, we want people to do, working hard. But the thing is that this is also something that's kind of expected from a highly educated professional. So if you've got nothing else to do than say what, people are actually supposed to be doing, maybe it's that you don't have anything that positive to say. And less speculatively and kind of embedding our work into more established and a long tradition in social sciences that has looked at how we talk about individuals in education and in the labor market, what we find really fits a canonical pattern that's been discussed for a very long time. So more specifically in the sociology of education, seminal work by Bourdieu and Passeron looked at how teachers talked about students, so pupils, and they observed that people from minoritized group, and in particular working class students, tended to be the ones that received this sort of second best type of compliments. In experimental psychology, there's been, experiments that have looked into what we say we want from somebody we recruit versus what we actually want when we elicit the preferences. And this really good paper by Say and Banakaji, what they do is that they look at musicians and they ask professional musicians to select a musician for their orchestra. And they find that people say that what they want is somebody who rehearses a lot and works really hard. But when given the possibility of choosing based on the same audition, they will choose the one that is described as a natural talent. So that's the sort of like kind of line of work that we embed our work on and our results on. And in our settings, we also push that one step forward and we look at the actual outcomes of these students for whom we receive the letters. And we see that, so outcomes in terms of how they actually place. And we see that letters that tend to emphasize those hard work and characteristics, they tend to be associated among students who actually place in academia with lower ranks of their academic recruitment, especially for women. So working hard is a good thing, but maybe not such a positive signal when you're looking at these types of highly educated professions. So just to conclude here, what we highlight with this paper is kind of the overall bigger picture is that institutional and psychological elements and sort of more implicit types of biases can help explain why there's such a slow progress in terms of representation. Institutional in the sense that in many academic fields and in science, we still tend to rely on the word of people without putting any kind of structure into it. And without really thinking about how these institutions will play out in terms of how they interact with our implicit biases. And to have a little bit of perspective, in other highly educated professions, in like high-ranking positions, for instance, in tech, there's not such a big reliance in reference letters. Actually, people rely more on quick screening and then having people conduct a lot of tests. So this institutional setting may rely on psychological factors, so implicit biases and stereotyping, to then have an impact on women's careers. Policy consequences are hard to extrapolate from our research, but we hope that documenting this, which was a primer, nobody had done it before, can be a first step towards improvement and we base this claim in other work that's been done in education, particularly looking at how students talk about their teachers when they have to evaluate them. And in this paper, Boring and Philippe, I think, show that whenever you tell students that there's biases in the way students talk about their teachers, once you tell them, they tend to reduce gender and ethnic bias in their references. So thank you for your attention. If you've got any comments, I'm happy to take questions now, or you can also email them or engage via social media. Thanks.
Valeria, fantastic. A wonderfully clear presentation and incredibly interesting and fascinating, which raises loads of questions. Let me kick off with two questions for you. One, which is sort of methodological, sort of technique-wise, and one which is just to do with the results. You use these natural language processing techniques here, where you're identifying sort of the words that are most commonly used. My question is, do you do any work on the context in which those words are used or the intensity associated with those words? You know, think of the word quiet, which was one of the words that you highlighted earlier. You could have somebody saying that this candidate is very quiet, or this candidate used to be quiet, but is no longer so. And the context, therefore, is very, very different. So one question is about how you're thinking about context and intensity, which I think can be done with some of these techniques. And the second question is, it wasn't quite clear to me, maybe I missed it, over what time period you have this data for 12,000 reference letters, and whether you've done any investigation of whether there has been any changes over time.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for this. So the quick answer for the question on context is yes and no. So yes, there's to some degree we can look at context because we allow to have just one word or multiple words surrounding a word. So we can say, so we get something like very good is common enough that it gets picked up as an expression. Now, that's just like a first degree answer. The second degree answer is that's a little bit rough as a context because we've got many different ways to express context in like quite sophisticated long sentences. And that's, I think, what you mean, say, well, some of these NLP algorithms are better at doing. That's true with like the new transformer type of architecture. You're better at capturing that context. Now, we don't do that. This is like, let's say, level 1, relatively simple NLP. So we don't do that. So we could move to like an extension of this work where we rely on something like that. The problem is that it becomes then a lot more complex, right? So you've got so many ways to express different sentiment that it's going to become really hard to get a picture like the one that I was showing before, where you get just very few words. Like you increase the complexity of the problem by quite a bit. So that's, I think, a little bit of a caveat. Second caveat too is that, so we've been exploring the possibility of getting a machine to gauge the sentiment by looking at this context. Like you train it to say this hard work or this is ability. It works sort of okay. It's not perfect. Scaling this up at the moment still has problems because the most sophisticated NLP algorithms that you find are not, you have to rely on platforms to do it, and so that kind of creates a problem of privacy. So at the moment we're not going that way. And the second question was to do with the change. So the time frame. So the time frame, we've got 4 years, so it's from 2017 to 2021. So that's what we've got at the moment. I found it quite interesting. So because this was for the time span of an academic paper published relatively quickly, we don't have a before and after this got publicized. But I think in 1 or 2 years, this is something that we should be doing because, I mean, it wasn't intended for us to do it, but this ended up going a little bit viral. So it was posted on social media, and then a lot of academics started talking about it. informally, I've known from different people across different institutions that it prompted discussions in recruitment committees and in placement committees. And I've seen informally also on social media that there's just only of economists. This time of year is the moment where they start advertising the profiles of their students. I've seen a lot of brilliant being thrown around. So I thought, well, maybe this is something to look at in the future. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Richard, I can see that you've got your hand up, but I'm not sure if we've enabled microphones or not. Can you try speaking?
I think I've been unmuted. Valeria, sorry, you can't see me, but you can hear me, hopefully.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Right? I think you should be commended for not drawing conclusions that the analysis does not support, but at the same time, I am very disappointed that you didn't. Because we're sort of, at the end, we're left hanging. What should we do now? And one obvious implication of the research presented is that seniors like me should write better letters, right? Or at least write neutral letters, gender neutral letters. But are there things that can be done? Do the hiring committees actively correct for this? Do we need to develop software tools that rewrite letters in a gender neutral way? What should we do now? And I fully appreciate that your research doesn't answer that question, but undoubtedly you have thought about it. So I'd like to hear your speculation.
Yeah, so thanks for that. So, I mean, I'm quite reluctant to speculation usually, but so there's a couple of things. So number one, in terms of policy, I think the most direct evaluation that we can do is figure out whether in 2, 3, or 4 years we're going to see a change in the way people write, right? So is being aware enough? I think that's level one. The level two, so informally, I know that certain institutions started having policies in terms of revising their letters. So there's certain words that they explicitly said should be avoided. So I don't remember exactly what the words were. I was told I should have written down, but specific words were to be avoided. I know that in other fields there's like very detailed analysis in terms of like you go and say you don't say about somebody that they're hard workers because this and that or that. So there's specific policies in terms of rescoping the language that people use. And I do think that it wouldn't be so costly for institutions to just analyze the content of the letters of candidates they are sending. Now, for an institution that sends very few candidates, that's quite hard because you do need a little bit of maths. But if you're an institution that's been sending candidates in the market for 10 or 7 for a while, you can already see patterns and whether there's specific people in your institution that have a more marked difference and just having a discussion about that. So that's quite informal form of policies that can be implemented at the institutional level. Then I think it's more a question for fellow researchers that are more experimental is to try out whether specific formats work better. I know, so academics were quite reluctant to compare ourselves to the private sector, but in the private sector, there's quite a lot of work in terms of how do you recruit. So in specific fields, they've completely moved out of reference letters. In other fields, they're super specific. So there's like a template of questions that are asked, and you just answer those questions. So is it the case that professional associations of academics, we should consider doing that, putting word limits? So there's something, this is speculative, of course, but are letters the norms that are super long? So people feel like they have to fill in. Actually, we don't see an enormous difference in terms of the length of the letter. But if you're actually somebody who feels like they need to fill in, will you just rely more on stereotypes than if you had like a word limit with specific questions that you needed to answer? So that's more, I think, my prescription there would be like, let's not just put a format without having any evidence, but there needs to be some work in terms of like, what's the best format and what's the kind of structure for these letters that would work best in terms of alleviating implicit biases. Thanks.
Thank you, Valeria. Alan.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Valeria. That's really very interesting indeed. I got a question that I don't know if you've got an answer to, but I mean, there are two stages in this. One is how, as it were, the supervisor, the professor assesses the candidate, and the other is how they write about them. And in a sense, focusing on the writing of these references suggests that in some sense, the issue is they just don't write it right. Somehow they just don't write in the same way for women. But it could be the more fundamental problem of one of assessment. And I mean, I think there's been some research, hasn't there, on referees' reports. I wonder about sort of PhD reports, whether it was possible to find other ways to try and pin down, as it were, the base level of bias, and then ask, is the writing adding bias or even subtracting bias?
So thanks for this. So let me try to answer. So is there a way in which we actually assess? So not only how we write, but how we assess a candidate. So we do see, I mean, let me talk about empirical evidence that may help me structure an answer to what you've asked. So one element that we observe in our data that I think is important to highlight is that if we take our sample and we really consider just the difference within a writer, so we only look at writers that have written a lot of letters in our sample. So there's a subset of our sample because obviously we only have 4 years. So we look at them and only the differences within the same letters that they've written. We see that there's stark difference in terms of stereotyping between those that tend to write a lot for women versus those who don't. So basically, that's the only women they've written a letter for in 4 years. And most of the stereotyping does come from these people who don't engage a lot with women. So that kind of suggestively say that there may be something in the way you approach women or you interact with women that could be at play because you're just not that familiar with having female students. So that sort of pushes the research a little bit more in terms of knowing, is it like the language that you don't know how to use, or is it really that you don't know how to approach these candidates? I think there may be a little bit of both. The second element is that you don't know how to approach is a much trickier question because you can't just solve that by saying we're just now going to rely on this form that through an experiment I've figured out is great, because that really implies that the kind of relationship that gets built over 3 or 4 years that you work with a student is inherently different for some supervisors between men and female candidates. And the way you target that, I think, is a lot more complex. It really becomes a human resource difficulty. There's a little bit of a suggestive evidence as well on the fact that there may be an element of the second point. Just when you see in the very unsupervised analysis, the kind of words that appear for men and the words that appear for women, is to say men are described when their personality shows up as being nice guy, pleasant, cool, somebody you want to hang out with using this very American terminology, because these letters have the kind of very American twist to them. And you don't see that for women. There's not a way to convey that professionally appropriately for women. So you can say, oh, this is a great guy. It's quite different. This is a pleasant female colleague to interact with. And so that may reflect that we just don't have words to say that, or just that people don't have these warm relationships with their female PhD students, which, definitely raises a question. Thanks.
If I just come in on that, but that kind of raises the question in my mind, again, this down to these natural language processing techniques, as to whether you're comparing the use of language in these references to the average use of language in some base.
So the base is the letters. So we precisely have a quite conservative approach to this, in the sense that we could have relied on more sophisticated algorithms, and so ways of representing our data that would have meant that our algorithm would have been trained on a corpus of normal text.
Yes.
We don't do that because these are super different corpuses.
Yeah.
So if you, so words such as ability is like super connotated in economics, whereas in normal text that's not the case. And so we do take a quite conservative approach there. And so this is kind of self-contained, if that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. Carolyn, I believe you have a question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
was wondering if you can also test for differences across like characteristics of the writer. So do you have like, I don't know, the seniority of the writer,
Yes.
or also if they are men or women? Because I could imagine more junior people tend to be maybe a little bit more, I don't know, somber in their writing and not write something like a great guy or something like this, that more senior people might be more comfortable. And then it also gets down to, I guess, how women and men approach asking people to write letters for them. I could imagine that women are less likely to ask like very senior people to write for them. Just wondering if that might be something also driving those results. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's so the second point you raise is very good, because we didn't look at the difference in the rank of writers between men and women. What we do look at is the difference in the language used depending on the rank. And there, indeed, so you've got the right intuition in that this form of stereotyping is a lot more marked for more senior academics. So it's a lot more marked. Then we started observing kind of weird patterns for more juniors. There's also fewer juniors. So it seemed to be the case that, associate professors engage a little bit less in stereotyping, but assistants, again, a little bit more. So that can be due to sample size, but very precisely estimated and super strong. Established professors, and especially among established professors, those who got their PhDs late, earlier, so they're kind of a little bit older. In academic terms, they tend to engage a lot more in this sort of differential writing. So yeah, that's definitely something we observe.
Again, in a kind of similar vein in terms of how you can cut up the data, I'd be fascinated to know whether you've looked at whether, for example, there are any differences depending on the country origin of who is writing the reference, and also whether there are differences across broad disciplines in economics, that development economics or game theory, that the references tend to be biased in different ways.
Yeah, so we looked into this. We looked into the origin of the letter writers, so where they were from, or if we didn't have a clarity in terms of where they were from, where they had gotten their undergraduate degree from. And we observe, and then we classify these origins depending on how gender conservative these countries are, as measured by the World Value Survey. And we see that there's no difference. So the same kind of patterns emerge. I remember the full result, I don't remember, maybe it's a little bit more stark if you come from gender conservative countries, but it's not the case that it's only them, basically, that are engaging in this form of stereotyping. So that was the first question. And then the second question was to do with
disciplines in economics.
Yes, disciplines. So we took quite a bit of time to divide people into disciplines. It's quite hard to do. But we ended up finding like broad groups of research that roughly we wanted to capture people who are more likely to interact with one another. So there were like 4 broad groups. And so if you present, let's say, a job market paper, like the kind of audience that is going to ask you questions, take you out for dinner, that sort of broad groups, the applied people, macro people, theorist kind of people. And so we see the first thing that we wanted was to make sure that the effect was not driven or let's say that the effect didn't vanish in applied economics. And in particular, is that there's a lot of women in applied economics, and a lot of applied economics requires a lot of hard work. So it wasn't just like the characteristic of the discipline. It wasn't just, you have to clean all these data and get it over with. And so we do see that stereotyping appears within that field, which was quite an important sanity check for results. Then we see, so depending on the approach we take, we did see that the divergence between like less ability and more grindstone is quite stark in theory. And that echoes also, like sheds a different light on other work that's been done in other fields, especially in psychology, about how fields that are very relying on math and on theory and abstraction, they tend to value a lot natural ability, actually. And so there it's particularly problematic that we see this divergence between like natural ability and hard work. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Does anybody else want to pose a question? I can see no more hands up. Okay, so in that case, let me ask you one more final question, Valeria. I mean, I think this is fascinating work. I mean, incredibly thought-provoking for all of us, I think. Also going back to Richard's question at the very beginning, what do we do with this now? How do we respond to this, both as individuals, but also as a discipline or as departments? So I'm not surprised in some sense that this went viral, because I think it is really illuminating and very important. My question to you is, what are you now going to do with this sort of work? Where are you planning to take this work? So I assume, and we briefly chatted about this beforehand, that you do want to continue this line of research.
Yeah, so we've got different avenues that we're exploring to push this forward. So just focusing on like narrowly a very similar setting, we are looking into studying the way different minorities, or now we learned that the way you say this is minoritized groups, are described. So along different lines, especially along lines of ethnicity differences. And so whether you see also these patterns emerging. And I think we want to fit this into a broader agenda of understanding diversity in science and in the professions of knowledge production. And so we're also collecting in data on the placement of PhD candidates, so still in economics, but like focusing on the elite. So looking at the top institutions in the world and how they place their candidates in the last 20 years. So for every candidate, we'll know who has written a letter for them, who has supported, who was their committee, and where they end up, and getting a sense of whether informal networks matter. So whether you see networks of referees who tend to place always in the same place, to again highlight the cultural dimension of this, that if you enter the right network, you may end up in the right place versus not, if you remain peripheral throughout your career. And then we're also a lot more exploratory, and not sure we'll be able to actually do this, but in the more near future, we also want to look into more administrative data. And with administrative data, like where you have the records of an entire country, figuring out who is it that ends up in knowledge production occupations. So whether that's science and academia, R&D, so think like advanced, like high-paying jobs in journalism, so knowledge production, who ends up there. And then ideally there, if we have administrative records, we do want to look at inequalities not only of gender, but class-based. So is it the case that, it's only a specific fraction of society that's feeding into knowledge production, which really then has an equity and efficiency problem that I highlighted at the beginning of the talk, or do we see like widespread representation in knowledge? So anybody has the same chance of ending up producing knowledge.
And the sort of data that you pulled together from econ job market, is anything like that available for other disciplines? Can you do this for other disciplines?
So my short answer, so I think disciplines that are not so far from economics, in particular, so I talked to somebody who was in organizational behavior, so like business school types, they do have similar platforms and structure. Then otherwise, I think the short answer is no. So the other disciplines tend to be a lot less structured. So it's not everybody who works on the same platform. Or I know in literature, for instance, they used to have these big conferences as well, where everybody would interview, but universities don't follow the procedure. So they didn't coordinate, or like they don't respect the coordination device strongly enough, and they don't all do the same thing at the same time. So I think for economics, there's that thing of, the job market being so structured that allows you to pull out all this information. And in hard sciences, then, you end up with the mess that people just do postdoc after postdoc after postdoc before landing a job. So that, I think that the reliance on informal networks is just really, really important, because it's like your PI, PhD supervisor picking up the phone and landing you a postdoc somewhere. These sort of practices are quite common.
Yeah, but I guess you might think that university HR departments would have copies of all the reference letters that they have received.
It depends on how the process is followed. So that would depend then on each institution. So an HR department can decide to do this. That's for sure. And if you get access to the data, that's amazing. There are other instances where we think we want to get permission to use other forms of data as well, like UCAS, where you have teachers writing about students. So any kind of setting where you've got that is great. Then you just need the permission to access it. So obviously, for us, Job Market was a privileged interlocutor with whom, they would understand what we were aiming at doing. They understood how we were going to anonymize that. So the discussion, in terms of data use is a lot smoother.
Alan.
But yeah, if you've got like one HR department that's willing to cooperate, then it's just outstanding, because you can do it. I mean, processing any PDF.
Presumably there are GDPR issues and one has to be very, very careful.
So in terms of GDPR, for here, what happens is that in Europe, you are allowed to use data that you collected for a purpose that's not the purpose you intended the data collection for, as long as that is non-commercial and that your project is meeting ethical standards. So basically, you are going to ensure that the data is protected, that you track who is accessing the data, that you're putting in a server with security standards, that results are anonymized, and so on. So the standard procedure, as long as your project is ethical, you are allowed to use this data if the output is non-commercial in academic research. So it's feasible. Just need to convince the HR department that it is.
That's very interesting. Alan, you've put your hand up again.
I don't know whether this is useful at all, but there are other large structured recruitment exercises. I was thinking about the civil service. I think we write references for civil servants, entry grade civil servants, and presumably things like police forces or the forces. It may be worth, and they certainly have an interest in trying to root out biases. It may be worth seeing if you can contact them.
No, we're super keen on expanding this to especially a profession that, so if you think of the civil service, number of people that touches is enormous, or the police. So thanks for that.
Well, they ought to like it. They profess to like this sort of thing. So, you never know. They might weaken, if you ask.
Thank you.
And on that helpful suggestion, we're approaching 2:00. So, Valeria, thank you so much. As I said, that was incredibly fascinating and important and interesting. Good luck with the ongoing work, and hopefully we can invite you back in a year or two.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.